Part 1 of this series, I'll narrate America's ascent from World War I to World War II, and in Part 2, I'll show how the United States then expanded its empire and retained its power long after due. Without further ado, let's dive into it. World Order proudly presents Super Imperialism, the economic strategy of the American Empire. So the story begins in 1917, with Britain and France fighting the Germans during the First World War. Tanks roll in, machine guns roar, and soldiers drop dead left, right and centre. The Germans are winning, and it's as all hope seems lost that Britain and France are suddenly saved by the United States. Led by President Wilson, the Americans charge in and push the Germans back all the way back to Berlin. Now this was done out of necessity. You see, during the First World War, American financiers like JP Morgan and many others had lent the European allies loans which they then used to combat the Germans. But by 1917 it was beginning to look like a wasted effort. The Germans were winning, and this has led many to speculate about people associated with JP Morgan pressuring President Wilson to intervene on their behalf. How the president did this is its own story, which I've also partly covered in What the PR Industry Doesn't Want You to Know. So the Allies begin winning, and come November 1918 have done so much that Germany begins imploding and its people begin to turn. All seems well until Britain and France are caught off guard by President Wilson, who spins around and demands that the Allies begin paying America back for their loans. Now Hudson argues that the United States could have named the terms on which it supplied the world with dollars. He argues that America could have helped foreign countries pay back their war debts. The country could have specified what imports it wanted or was willing to take, but it didn't, nor did it ask or permit debtor countries to pay their exports to the United States. The suggestion is that America took the opportunity to gain at Europe's expense. Britain and France are shocked and profess that there is little they can do. Wilson shows little sympathy and demands that the British and French find a way to pay America back. Hudson goes as far as to argue that in the history of warfare, no ally had ever requested such payments for its military support. Countries had helped one another fight wars before. This is what France had done when they were helping America fight off the British during the late 18th century. But they didn't expect any repayment. They simply did it because they didn't want Britain to win, and for them that was enough. But Wilson changes the game by making his contributions loans rather than subsidies. Britain and France begin to panic, and they turn on the one person they know they can exploit. Germany is squeezed of all its worth, and this ruffles some feathers. None more so than a young corporal by the name of Adolf Hitler, who sets up a party by the name of the National Socialists. Britain and France try relieving their debts by selling off their goods to the United States, but their efforts fall flat when America imposes tariffs on all goods coming from Europe. Britain and France have little choice but to impose higher taxes on their citizens. France goes even further by invading Germany's most valuable area, the Rhineland. This makes Germany even angrier and results in Adolf Hitler launching a putsch against the German government. Much of this happens as America is having the time of its life. Their booming industry and post-war returns have resulted in a golden age of prosperity. F. Scott Fitzgerald writes The Great Gatsby, my favourite book, and Americans begin drinking and partying in the speakeasies and jazz bars of the 1920s. In Germany, the Weimar government defeats Hitler and sends him to prison after he fails to throw a putsch in 1923. But the country remains desperate and turns to American financiers for additional loans to rebuild their economy. Britain and France join in and begin borrowing like never before. Now, not all of this was bad, by the way, but the borrowing enabled these subordinates to enjoy mini versions of their own Roaring Twenties. This was modest compared to the American one, but even places like Germany saw technological advances and danced the nights away in the jazz bars of the time. Regardless, the debt they all owed to America overshadowed the era. The Europeans impoverished their national treasuries and run deeper and deeper into debt. Hudson argues that the policy of compelling the European allies to meet their interest charges was political aggression of the highest order. He claims that it violated the implied promises made during the war by the United States to its allies. It's during this time that the Europeans begin referring to the United States as Uncle Shylock. Make of that what you will. Former Prime Minister Lloyd George describes an interaction between the new British government officials and their American counterparts in the early 20s as that between a weasel and its quarry. When we look at the terms America imposed on Britain, this frustration becomes understandable. Hudson draws attention to the interest rates the United States placed on Britain in the aftermath of World War I. Just have a look at the gap between those they imposed on Britain and those they imposed on everyone else. It's really quite shocking, and the evidence kind of supports this whole thesis that America actively sought to replace Britain as global hegemon. America uses this money to turbocharge its economy into the richest in the world. By 1928, nearly 30% of bank assets were devoted to broker loans to finance stock market speculation. To put this simply, 30% of the money banks had was being given by brokers to investors so that the latter could bid on businesses that could potentially rise in value. But much of this changes when the stock market crashes in 1929. People are made unemployed, there's chaos on the streets, America calls on the Europeans to repay their loans, but Europe fights back and insists that they can't because of how unfair the terms are. Now, many American senators attack Europeans with claims that they are all unifying against the United States. Senator Reed of Pennsylvania dismisses as silly the idea that a payment of war debts could present any difficulty to a country like Great Britain. But President Hoover shows restraint and argues against going too hard on their European allies for fear of establishing a united front against the United States on economic questions. Hoover's inability to deal with the financial crisis, however, brings an early departure, and Europe is throttled when America elects US Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt insists that the Europeans repay the Americans regardless of circumstance. Britain deplores this demand and threatens to strengthen its exchange position through measures further restricting British purchase of American goods. This is basically like a less developed country today squaring up to America. But the British really have very little leverage. They default on their payments and announce that they can no longer keep up with the war debt repayment. The US refuses to forgive these debts, leading to a long-term resentment between these two. Roosevelt devalues the dollar, and overnight US goods become cheaper. Europe becomes unable to compete, and the debts they owe suddenly become larger. Roosevelt then takes things further by forcing the foreign debt governments to nationalize properties held by large corporations in order to turn them over to the American government. In Germany, people begin to turn to the one man promising to do anything about this. Hitler begins building back Germany's army, and between 1933 and 1940 establishes the country as the largest force on the continent. Roosevelt remains unfazed and dedicates this time to expanding US trade surplus from $225 million to $1.4 billion. None of this alleviates the growing concerns Europeans have about Hitler, who, by all appearances, can't stop threatening invasion. In March 1936, he remilitarizes the Rhineland. In March 1938, he annexes Austria. In September 1938, he takes the Sudetenland, and this results in the Munich Agreement later that month. Britain and France promise to recognize his gains, primarily because they're weak, and Hitler takes advantage of their naivety by taking all of Czechoslovakia. Britain and France had been willing to stomach much of what Hitler did, primarily because of the buffer he added against the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin. But then Hitler fools all of them by teaming up with Stalin and invading Poland. Britain and France declare war, and Hitler swiftly turns back round and knocks out France. British soldiers rush to the rescue, but are quickly overwhelmed by the German attack. They manage to survive by escaping from the Germans on the beaches of Dunkirk, and Hitler goes after Russia, and this gives Britain time to rebuild. America makes a killing during this time by selling weapons, aircraft, ships, and supplies to countries such as Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. Come 1940, Britain begins nationalizing the overseas investment holdings of its large companies and selling them off to American buyers. The country generates a total of $4.5 billion, $3.6 billion of which it spends on arms from the United States. Churchill believes that this had helped their cause, but is shattered when Hitler then hits them with bullets in 1940. Come 1941, Britain is destroyed and has become so desperate that it enters the Lend-Lease agreement with America. This is overseen by Secretary of Treasury Henry Morgenthau, who demolishes any hope Britain has of keeping its empire. Amongst the lease's terms are the dismantling of the Commonwealth economic arrangements. Whereas before, the British Empire operated as a closed economic system, with colonies favouring British goods through tariff protections, now this system is dismantled and left open for American industries who are revitalized by the war. Now, America does all this, regardless of the pro-British entourage that existed in the country. Sympathizers like Joe Kennedy, JFK's dad by the way, urged for more restraint with their British counterparts. But Roosevelt sees an opportunity, and under his watch, US businesses begin penetrating the once protected zone of the British Empire. Between 1940 and 45, America uses the 99-year leases given to it by Britain to open bases in former colonies like the Caribbean, Newfoundland, Labrador, and modern-day Guyana. Roosevelt dies in 1945, but his mission is completed by Harry Truman, who on the 30th of January 1946 forwards the British loan deal to Congress and officially brings down the curtain on the empire. So why am I saying this? Why am I saying bringing down the curtain on the empire? Well, to continue financing its economy after World War II, Britain has no choice but to take a $3.75 billion loan, $57 billion in today's money, from the US with a really high interest rate. And on the 15th of July, Congress finally extends a line of credit to Britain to this amount. And this loan wouldn't be paid back until 2006. From 1946 onwards, well, to me it's from earlier, maybe from 1941 onwards when they start taking the loan, Britain becomes dependent on the dollar by borrowing from America to meet its obligations. And this is essentially the tale of how America displaced Britain as global hegemon. Really hope you've enjoyed this first part. If you have, then give it a thumbs up. If you're new here, subscribe. World Order covers all things geopolitics. I also take global figures and retell their stories as epic works with action, adventure, sci-fi, fantasy, and opera. These stories appear as World Order Black labels and are truly my pride and joy. So if you haven't already, do go check those ones out. If you're more interested in documentaries and factual stuff, then just watch more of my red labels. Loads of really good ones. And be sure to follow me on all available social media. I've left it all in the description below. So guys, that's all for now. Guys, thanks again. And stay tuned because I'll be releasing part 2 of this story very soon as well. Thanks again, take care, and I hope to hear from you all very soon. Bye bye.